The Ring 4. David Benavidez versus Anthony Yarde, Devin Haney versus Brian Norman Jr., Jesse Bam Rodriguez versus Fernando Puma Martinez, and Sam Noakes versus Abdullah Mason. 4 incredible matchups on the same card, taking place this weekend on the 22nd, and I'm going to pick every single fight on the card, look at the tape in detail, and ultimately pick a winner. All 4 of these matchups I'm really looking forward to, but I've not really seen anyone talk about fights outside the top 4. There are 4 fights before Sam Noakes versus Abdullah Mason, but in fairness the first 3 are not really worth watching. Muhammad Al-Akel is an industry plant. It seems like he fights on every single Riyadh season card, even though he's not very good. But there is one decent fight on there, Vito Milnicki Jr. versus Samuel Namoma. Milnicki has been a young prospect for a while, at first fighting for PBC and now for Top Rank. He was fast-tracked a bit too early and took a loss versus James Martin, but he's learned from that, improved a lot, and he's now a complete boxer. Samuel Namoma is a Nigerian-born Italian boxer, 21-0 and 5 KOs. To be honest, he's not that good. He's never fought outside of Italy. There's not much sting to his punches. I think Vito will outbox him to a decision. Moving on to the first of the 4 main fights, Sam Noakes versus Abdullah Mason. Now, OGs will remember I made a video about Sam Noakes about a year ago. He was and still is one of my favourite British fighters. I've been following him for a long time, betting on him for a long time. He's a great fighter to watch, and he's also very skilled to go with it. Noakes does have the appearance of a one-dimensional plodding puncher, but if you pay attention to what he's doing and how he's consistently been doing it against every level of competition he faces, he's become more and more impressive to watch as his career has gone on. His most destructive performance came when he faced Lewis Sylvester. It was intended to be a sort of 50-50 matchup, boxer versus puncher, undefeated versus undefeated, but Noakes completely walks through him, battering him to the body and then stopping him in 3 rounds. Sam Noakes is an expert at cutting off the ring. What he seems to specialise in is closing the distance and not allowing his opponent to have any way of escaping. He's very good at avoiding the clinch. He uses his natural strength to his advantage very well, and he's actually got a decent jab and decent shot selection as well. He was given a decent step-up fight versus Ivan Mendy, someone who gave issues to guys like Denis Berinchik and beat Luke Campbell. He completely shut out Mendy for 12 rounds, proving that he's just as effective versus durable, experienced opponents. But there is one glaring elephant in the room when it comes to this fight versus Abdullah Mason. Sam Noakes is not the fastest. In fact, he's quite slow with his hands and with his feet. Noakes has been exceptional on the British level, despite his speed, but when he's taken such a big step up as he's taken this weekend, it's really going to show. His opponents haven't been confident or quick enough on the counter to really make him second guess something on the front foot. Him being as slow as he is does mean his shots are quite easy to see coming. He tends to lead a lot with a jab, which is good for him because it allows him to push his opponents to the ropes and also measure distance. But when Noakes throws the right hand over the double jab, Abdullah Mason has the perfect amount of speed and timing to catch Noakes when he does that. The reason I keep emphasising speed in this matchup is you can simply see it. Look how fast Abdullah Mason's timing is. Abdullah Mason is one of those absolute top level talents where there's such a short window of time between his opponents throwing a punch and him countering. It's a game of split-second frames when it comes to guys like him, reminiscent of Stevenson, Crawford, Mayweather. Even though Noakes may be physically stronger, Noakes is a far better athlete. Noakes' head is quite centre-line. I believe Mason will piece him up with a jab at distance and with a check hook. Noakes is going to recognise Mason's timing and is going to be much more reserved as a result. So I think Mason will be having his way at distance. Sam's nose starts bleeding, starts reddening from the jabs. Mason starts getting confident enough to throw the left hand, and I think eventually the ref will have seen enough and the fight is stopped about round 9. A TKO win for Abdullah Mason. Taking us to the second of the big 4, Jesse Bam Rodriguez versus Fernando Puma Martinez. Again, I want to introduce the lesser known fighter first. Fernando Martinez is the former unified 115-pound world champion. Technically should still be unified champion, but politics took his IBF belt away. Fernando Martinez is one of the most violent and aggressive fighters in the sport. One of my favourites to watch. He barely knows what a jab is. All he knows is pressure, volume and power shots. And most importantly, he's incredibly durable and doesn't slow down. He won his first title shot back in 2022 when he faced the Filipino defending champion Joanan Cajas, ending the Filipino's 6-year-long streak as IBF champion by outworking him to a 12-round decision. They would have an immediate rematch in which Martinez won again by clear-cut decision, then has a tough fight in his second defence versus another Filipino, Jade Boni, a fight in which he faced adversity but eventually won by TKO because he burst Boni's eardrum, and then ultimately unified versus WBA champion Kazuto Ioka. For reference, Kazuto Ioka is one of the pound-for-pound best in the lower divisions, a multi-weight world champion with wins over guys like Donny Nietes and Kosei Tanaka, as well as winning a razor-close decision over Francisco Rodriguez Jr. Ioka is one of the best counterpunchers in the sport, so on paper this should be a really tricky matchup for Martinez because Ioka is such a good counterpuncher and Martinez is so aggressive. But what he simply did was overwhelm Ioka to the point where he can't be comfortable enough to land his counters, and that's what he did as he ultimately won the fight by decision. But at the same time it was very competitive and had an immediate rematch because of it. The rematch turned out to be quite a downgrade in performance for Martinez, because Ioka had now been accustomed to the aggression of Martinez. He was now a lot more confident in pushing him back and sitting down on counters, to the point where Martinez actually got put down for the first time in his career in the second half of the fight. Ioka hits him with a perfectly timed 2-3 right on the chin. Martinez doesn't go down, but he follows up twice with the same combination and he goes down, which is quite a bad sign in terms of his survival instincts being hit by the same thing twice. Now there is a glaring difference between Fernando Martinez and Jesse Bam Rodriguez, and that's his footwork. As good as Ioka is, he's very static and likes to stay in the same position, which allows for someone like Martinez to overwhelm him, because he's not quick enough on his feet to avoid most of the attacks. Jesse Rodriguez, on the other hand, is just as good on the counter as Ioka is, but much better and much lighter on his feet. In fact, there's a good case to be made for Jesse having the best footwork in the entire sport. The angles he utilises you simply don't see in boxing right now. I think Bam is at his best as a counterpuncher when his opponents make opportunities for him, and no one makes more opportunities than Fernando Martinez. He's got an excellent counter hook both to the head and to the body. The body shots will be key here because Fernando Martinez barely defends them. In the event that Martinez does get close enough with his shots, Jesse is really good with his guard. Jesse will be stabbing to the body. Bam is far better at distance, so it's just a matter of how long it takes for Martinez to open up, which won't be very long. And from there, I think it's going to be a countering masterclass for Martinez, and he gets a stoppage inside 6 rounds. Rodriguez is still continually improving fight by fight. Martinez is an interesting test because he's the most aggressive fighter Bam has faced, but that does play into Rodriguez's hands. What we've learned from Rodriguez fight by fight is that there's no style that really works against him. He's simply too versatile, and I think he's going to stop Martinez. And that's going to take us to the most intriguing fight of the card by far, Brian Norman Jr. versus Devin Haney. Now there's a reason the odds are dead even for this fight. I've actually changed my prediction quite a few times in this fight, to the point where I'm only just now settling on a winner while recording this video. Brian Norman Jr. is the lesser known of the two. He only really burst onto the scene last year, beginning with his spectacular knockout win over Giovanni Santillan. Santillan at the time was coming off an absolute destruction over Alexis Rocha, stopping him. The fight took place in Santillan's home territory. It was supposed to be Santillan's homecoming victory versus a fellow undefeated contender who at the time wasn't looking as good. I personally was quite certain that Santillan would win the fight, but as it turned out, Norman would put on a back foot countering masterclass, standing right on the inside countering Santillan as he came in, and then piecing him up on the inside, until he was eventually beaten down to the point where he couldn't get up. Norman was then shortly promoted to champion, and his first defense would be versus Derek Cuevas, another dangerous knockout puncher who Norman would tool with and stop in 3 rounds, followed by yet another brawler, Jin Sasaki, where he'd produced the knockout we've all seen by now. But you may notice a pattern. The last 3 opponents Norman's looked really good against have been brawlers, pressure fighters, high guards, slow feet, less jabs and more power shots. The last time Norman faced someone who was the opposite of that was when he faced Quinton Randall. Randall is slick, awkward, and has a great jab. In this fight, we see Norman look a lot sloppier than we do when he's on the back foot. His entries are not very calculated. He more or less just explodes and hopes something lands rather than cutting off the ring. And we saw in the process of him doing that, Randall was landing a lot of jabs. Because Norman himself does have slow feet and he's a still target, he was even gaining the confidence to throw the right hand and landing it in the process, and perhaps even more concerningly, he couldn't find a way out of the clinch. A lot of Norman's attempts at aggression were stifled by Randall's clinching, and if you know one thing about Devin Haney, he's a master of jabbing and clinching. Yet another case where Norman is not as effective on the front foot. His very last fight before facing Giovanni Santillan, he faced Janelson Bocachica, a very crafty, experienced fighter. Norman telegraphs and loads up on a right hand as Bocachica is backing up, gets caught by a straight right hand right in the face in the process and gets put down. Now, is Devin Haney likely to plant his feet and throw a punch like this? No, but it does show some lack of responsibility when he's on the front foot. Devin Haney, on the other hand, is a master when it comes to distance. He's not a master of damage, but his jab is very, very difficult to find a way around. The jab has been his bread and butter for his entire career. Normally, the combination of not having much power and not having a great chin would result in Haney losing to every single puncher he faces. But the fact that his distance management and his jab has been so good his entire career, as well as his conditioning and how quick he is on his feet, it is a bit of a nightmare to find your way around that punch. I would say in terms of Devin Haney's other opponents, Jorge Linares is his most similar opponent to Brian Norman Jr. He squares up, stands tall, hits hard, and looks for counters. Haney was completely in control for the first 7 rounds of that fight. But if we talk about the Jorge Linares fight, we have to talk about the moment where Haney got hurt. For the most part, Haney was getting very confident in this fight and was spending a lot of time on the inside. But he never really paid for it until the end of round 10. But Haney never really recovered from that punch, and he spent the next 2 rounds clinching to run the timer out. But I think it is fair to say that's a result of Haney spending too much time on the inside. So the next time he faced a solid, powerful counterpuncher in Regis Prograis, he spent almost no time on the inside at all, stayed behind the jab and countered Regis. This is also the best we've seen from Haney in terms of his right hand. This was his 140-pound debut, so naturally he was stronger and he looks more confident than ever. Which takes us immediately into his worst performance afterwards versus Ryan Garcia. Now obviously I do understand the whole Osterine controversy, but the issues we saw from Haney defensively in that fight are issues we've seen before, issues that he's gotten away with for the most part. It may have simply been a matter of time before someone as quick and snappy like Ryan was able to capitalise, because Ryan didn't look that good in that fight anyway. In the space between the first round and the first knockdown in round 7, Haney was clearly in front. Ryan didn't really have any answers behind the jab. But because Haney simply isn't that defensively responsible, he ended up getting caught again at some point. Now you could say simply Haney won't get caught again doing that because he's going to be safe this time. But with the exception of the first punch in round 1, Haney wasn't getting caught coming in. He was simply a bit too close for comfort and his guard was down. And we see Haney drop his hands a lot in several instances in different fights as well. Another important factor is that Norman, similar to Ryan, has nothing to worry about on the front foot. When Ryan got knocked down by Tank in the second round, he fought very reserved in the remaining rounds. That counter left hook took his confidence away. Haney is not a guy you've got to worry about getting too close to. He doesn't really do counters, he doesn't do pull counters, check left hooks. He's only really comfortable at long range. So as much as Norman may be way behind at distance, I think all it takes is the right timing on a particular punch where Haney drops his hands. Because Haney's attacks weren't particularly well set up or sophisticated in any way, they were just fast and well placed punches. Norman's not quite as fast as Ryan, but he is very fast himself and a lot stronger than Ryan. My initial pick for this fight was Devin Haney, simply sticking, jabbing and moving for the entire fight. But in order to trust Haney, a guy with a suspect chin, to do that for 36 minutes versus a dangerous puncher, I have to trust in the idea that Haney gives him something to worry about. And that's something we don't really see from Haney. He doesn't really have a counter game. It's not like Norman is facing Tank Davis, Teofimo Lopez, Keyshawn Davis. I think even Shakur Stevenson you've got more to worry about on the front foot. I think it's much better to trust the guy who's able to land that one punch and the other guy never recovers, as opposed to trusting a guy to box safely for 36 minutes, knowing that he's got all these poor defensive habits, knowing that he's got a history of poor recovery, knowing that if it turns into a firefight, Norman does not have to worry about what's coming back. I think Norman is a much more sophisticated boxer than Ryan. He's got much more than just a left hook. And one thing we could consider, Norman is getting better and better every fight. What if in the past 2 years he's gotten really good at cutting off the ring since the Quinton Randall fight? So my official prediction, I think Devin Haney is going to be way ahead in the first 6 rounds. I think for the most part it will play out the way I was envisioning it, but Haney will be working a lot harder than Norman will. Norman is a big, strong, powerful 147-pounder, and Haney's going to have to work and move constantly to keep him away. Whereas Norman simply has to bide his time and wait for the right moment. I think that moment will come around the final rounds, round 9 or 10. Haney dives in for a clinch, Norman clips him coming in. Haney goes a bit weak at the knees, tries his best to clinch and recover, but Norman just outmuscles him and beats him up. I think Haney will be a massive favourite live up to that point, but the fight changes drastically, and from that point Haney just keeps going down, and either the ref or the corner has to stop it. If any of you have seen Rashidi Ellis versus Royman Villa, I think it plays out quite similar. And that's going to take us to the main event, David Benavidez versus Anthony Yarde. This is definitely less intriguing compared to the last fight. Anthony Yarde has had a really weird, inconsistent career. Yarde took a massive step up and a massive risk in 2019 when he faced Sergey Kovalev in Russia. Yarde for the most part had just been beating up British journeymen, and while Kovalev was way out of his prime by that point, he was still defending champion. Yarde had that famous round 8 where he almost puts Kovalev out, but he fails to get the knockout, gasses himself out in the process, and then gets put down in round 11. But this was seen as more of a learning process for Yarde, which is why it was a bit confusing when he lost again at British level to Lyndon Arthur, essentially getting outboxed behind the jab for 12 rounds, despite Arthur suffering a shoulder injury halfway through the fight. It was an unexpected result, but Yarde was expected to rectify the wrong in the rematch. And that's exactly what he did. He came out violent, aggressive, but also calculated, keeping Arthur on the ropes and not letting up, until Arthur eventually went down in round 4. To this day, the most impressive win of Anthony Yarde's career. Then, for whatever reason, he's deemed ready to face another undefeated Russian champion, this time a better one, in Artur Beterbiev. He famously puts on a good account of himself versus Beterbiev. He hangs in there, hits Beterbiev with good shots throughout the fight, but ultimately Beterbiev's power, experience and his class is too much, and he eventually gets broken down and stopped in round 8. It was then back to British level at that point. He knocks out a couple of no-hopers, but the expectation for Yarde at this point is that he's been moulded by the Beterbiev and Kovalev fights, and that we were to see the best Yarde we've ever seen in his next fights. He then takes on a 17-1 Latvian boxer by the name of Ralfs Vilkins. Vilkins goes down in the first 10 seconds, but he doesn't go down again. Since Yarde had the expectation he was going to simply walk through this guy, him getting up and simply fighting back seems to confuse Yarde. And it's not like Yarde just got hit a few times, he lost 3 to 4 rounds of that fight. Oftentimes Vilkins would have the superior work rate and would also land the bigger shots of the round. It was like Yarde had the expectation that right hand would land, and it would land well, so he didn't really have to do any of that other boxing stuff like investing to the body, using a jab, counters, setting up counters. It was a very sloppy performance for his standards, but for the most part it was seen as a one-off, and he had the chance to prove he was still the same guy, because for whatever reason he was booked in a trilogy fight versus Lyndon Arthur. Now this fight in theory was a bit confusing. The only way Yarde could really impress in this fight is if he outperformed the previous meeting. The previous meeting was a difficult thing to replicate because it was a knockout win in 4 rounds, but hypothetically, if Yarde is the same guy that beat him that second time, he's going to do the same thing, or roughly the same thing. But as it turned out, Arthur would stand his ground a bit more. And because Yarde couldn't bully him around the ring, he was a bit clueless as to what to do. He did overall win the fight quite clear, but he could not assert himself the same way he did in the second fight. Now, I am inclined to believe that's as a result of Lyndon Arthur not shitting himself like he did last time, but I think to be a world level fighter, you can't drop rounds to Lyndon Arthur, and I think Arthur outworked him in 4 or 5 rounds of that fight. And I believe there's a certain light heavyweight who's a lot more likely to outwork him, and that's David Benavidez. Benavidez has had a bit more of a consistent trajectory. He didn't look great the first time he won a title versus Ronald Gavril, but he was very young, about 21 years old when he won that title. He developed as a boxer while defending that title, smushing guys like Andre Duell. Lost his belt but continued to beat guys like Caleb Plant and Demetrius Andrade, 2 certified world level opponents. Demetrius Andrade being a 2-division undefeated champion, who Benavidez embarrassed and basically made him retire. And because Canelo doesn't want to fight him at that point, he moves up to light heavyweight. He takes on Alexander Gvozdyk, a very experienced, very skilled former world champion. It is a very tough fight for Benavidez, especially in the second half, but to be honest, I would pick Gvozdyk in his old age to beat Yarde, then beats undefeated prospect David Morais. But the thing is, I don't think Benavidez is that big as a light heavyweight. I think between the two, Yarde will look more imposing. And the early rounds could be very shaky for Benavidez. In fact, he could get hurt. His footwork's not the best, he's very squared up, he's there to be hit. But I do think his offense is more than enough to deal with Anthony Yarde. And I think Benavidez wins by roughly 118-110 decision. I don't think Benavidez at light heavyweight, without the natural size advantage, is as much of a knockout guy. He'll be winning thoroughly, but not hurting him too much. So to recap my predictions, I've got Abdullah Mason, late stoppage around 9 or 10. Jesse Rodriguez, earlier stoppage around 4 or 5. Brian Norman Jr., comeback win around 9 or 10. And then David Benavidez decision, 118-110. And that's going to do it for the video. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.